Are we headed for a future of warring tribes, warlords, and cartels? It seems unthinkable, except in film. We assume the ship of state will continue cruising along confidently, even in rough seas. But what if life on the ship feels increasingly precarious, to such a degree that running to the life rafts suddenly seems a more viable, indeed an inevitable option? A cartographer of this likely future, Mike Maxwell joins us today on Deep Guild to discuss his new book, aptly titled The Tribal Future of the West. All right, so today we are joined by Mike Maxwell to discuss his new book, Tribal Future of the West. First of all, hello, Mike. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Lee. It's good to be joining you. We've talked before on Culture Dads, which is really cool, and we've also talked on Newark Roundtable. So just catching up with an old friend here. We've done a bunch of podcasts together so far.
Yeah, hopefully that will continue. But this is your first big book, Tribal Future of the West, your first big book, I think, since you released Cultured Thug at the end of 2024.
In Tribal Future, first of all, it's my own original thesis, although it obviously draws upon the work of many, many other people. And also, it was written in a much more scholarly tone. It's very dry and academic, really. It's could not be more different tone wise than the Culture Thug Handbook. So yeah, in that sense, it is a little bit of a surprise that people got so mad about it, but they have. I've only seen one person review it who's sort of like outside of the dissident sphere, and they did not like it very much at all. So yeah, no, but it's something I think that's really important that we need to talk about, because a lot of times we get sort of sucked into this outrage cycle, the current thing, like what's happening today, what's Trump been doing, and like how's he betrayed us, or whatever it is, like what's the latest scandal with Tucker Carlson or Nick Fuentes or whatever, all of these things. And it's very easy to miss the forest for the trees. But when we take a zoomed out look, when we try to look at the present moment, not in terms of, elections or even decades, but in terms of centuries, there's a very troubling picture that emerges. And this book is my attempt to sort of yank everyone out of the myopic, like current thingism, and to pull them back and give them the 30,000 foot view of what's going on. Because when you take that view, it should, if you've done your analysis correctly, it should change your orientation and send you off on a different direction, I would say.
Great. Yeah. I mean, speaking of that 30,000 foot view, can you kind of encapsulate your thesis succinctly for the listener who might not be familiar with it? And then just to add to your task, what was the reviewer's gripe against your thesis? What was the, so basically state what you were aiming for in the book, and what its critics or critic has found to disagree with.
Sure. Okay. So the thumbnail sketch of the book's thesis is basically that the West has entered upon a transition away from the post-Cold War order. But I mean, everybody realizes that the Cold War is over and that the end of history wasn't real. But where this book kind of differs from that is it tries to situate it within a much deeper and older cycle of historical development. Basically, what's happening now is that with the unraveling of the end of history, societies are regressing towards, and I don't say that word regress with even the slightest hint of denigration. We are going backwards toward an older pre-liberal form of life that's much smaller, more personal, and more based on loyalty rather than ideology. And what's driving this? Well, there's a number of things that are driving it, but one of the most important symptoms of this change is that you're getting challenges to the authority of central governments in the form of parasovereigns. So whereas we have had from, let's just say, at least the 17th century and maybe a little bit before that, whereas we've had a centralizing movement. So authority tends to, for the last several centuries, authority has gone from dispersed to centralized, generally speaking. Governments get larger, empires consolidate, and now we have what people are calling the global American empire, right? Like this almost unipolar, and certainly, at least for a while, unipolar hegemony over the entire globe. Whereas we were moving from dispersed to centralized authority, now what's happening is that trend has reversed, and it's reversed for some very historically deep reasons. These are not things that are going to go away anytime soon, even if we fix all our problems. And so basically where that's going is that you're seeing the breakup of sovereignty. The age of nations is passing. And this has really got a lot of people upset, because whether you're a nationalist or you're a post-nationalist, like globalist, that's very distressing to most people. And what's happening is that what I've called parasovereigns have begun to emerge. So as like state capacity is weakening, you're getting actors that are outside of the state apparatus, whether those be criminal networks or digital networks, or any number of other ones. I go through them in the book. They're starting to emerge and effectively replace the sovereign functions of the state. So replace things like local policing, replace things like arbitration and law, replace things like even like state services and things like that. Now, this is all happening very, it's just at the very beginning of this right now, but the move is unmistakable, and we've seen this in history before. So basically, we are going from a high point of centralization from, let's just say, the 1990s through to the beginning of the 2010s. Let's just say the Clinton era to the Obama era. That's the high point of centralization. Now things are beginning to unravel, and we are decentralizing.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but to make like a concrete example of what you're describing, decentralizing forces, you mentioned the book mentions the rise of like paramilitary groups or even like private military PMCs like Wagner, the Wagner organization, academia, Blackwater, as it was called. If you have enough capital, enough resources, you can hire on some of these groups to enact your political will, but it won't be it won't be from a centralized government. It could be like a tribe in Africa could hire Wagner. And so the centralizing force of a kind of a state-run military is being fractured by these PMCs and other organizations.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, essentially, the state is outsourcing a core function of sovereignty, which is the monopolization of force, and effectively contracting out to a mercenary. That's really what PMCs are.
Yeah.
And anybody who's read Machiavelli knows that this is usually a very, very, it's like Faustian bargain, right? Once this starts to happen, the prince, as Machiavelli would have said, or the state is like, it typically only happens when the state is really struggling to enforce its own law and to enforce its own will. So this is a good example. And there are many other examples of things like that in the book that I give. We can go into some of them. Things like mafias, things like religious enclaves.
Right. And the Faustian bargain that you mentioned, it was evident, when speaking of Wagner, when Prigozhin like turned on Putin, I don't know what that was all about, but for a few days, everyone was like, "Oh, this Prigozhin guy." it's going to take Wagner and like march on Moscow and displace Putin. So it is a Faustian bargain because sometimes these PMCs can kind of, rise up and actually threaten central authority itself. I don't know how much. Well, we can go into that, but so
Yeah.
you're right. There it is a bit of a Faustian bargain.
But just to finish laying out
I'm sorry.
rough sketch here. So we're seeing these decentralizing, or another word for it is centrifugal tendencies. Centrifuge being something that pushes matter away from the center, right? This is being decentered, and effectively, what's happening is that sovereignty operates in a kind of like a first law of thermodynamics, right? You can neither create nor destroy sovereignty. It can only be distributed in different ways. So it can be distributed in more or less centralized ways, and it's going from more to less centralized. And the results of that are things that people are really just not prepared for. And I think it's going to come as a real cold shower. And in fact, it's going to be very, very bad. So I wrote the book basically to give people a view of like what's actually coming in a way that was totally not alarmist, not saying that the sky is falling, that everything is going to be we're going to have like a headlong collapse or anything like that. I don't believe that that's going to happen at all. But I believe what will happen is something analogous to the end of the Roman Empire, which is also not really a collapse. It was a series of very much contained collapses that happened and were contained and then stabilized and then happened again and then were contained and stabilized. And that process repeated over the course of 3 or 4 centuries until people looked back over that time and said, oh, wow, something has gone away, right? There no longer is really a Western Roman Empire. So I believe that that's what's going to happen with the West. And what's going to come in its place is what I'm calling the tribal future, because tribalism is essentially the word that we use to describe this decentralized, patronage-based, personal loyalty-based sovereignty system. So the future is going to look a lot more tribal than it has in a very, very long time. And just to come back very quickly to that review, effectively what the person said was, I don't really disagree too much with what Mr. Maxwell is saying, but he seems to relish it. He seems to like it and wish for this, even though I put in the little signature thing at the beginning of the book. I was like, this book is dedicated to my children. I wrote it so that you would not inherit this future, that we could maybe avoid it. So maybe they missed that part of it. And I think that like over the course of the book itself, there is no even hint of an endorsement. Although at times I do say things like, that this is happening for reasons, and that modernity has failed, not by accident, and that maybe there is a logic to what's happening because modernity has wrought certain problems that only decentralization can solve, right?
Yeah.
And I think we can imagine what all those problems are. We're looking at them every single day. So maybe that was taken out of context, but that was essentially the gist of the review.
Right. The picture that one might imagine in a tribal future could be, some could imagine that it would be very bleak, kind of a war of all against all over scarce resources, kind of a damnation alley or a road warrior type scenario. But does it have to be that? I mean, could you imagine a tribal future that is peaceful and stable, that in which tribes in their own like fiefdom or whatever enact a certain form of parasovereignty, as you call it, but like one that works and one that is stable and peaceful and would give your children that future that you actually want them to have?
Well, I do think that the future that's coming is not going to be as materially good as what we've had. Basically, people rightly chastise the boomers for having a kind of ridiculously naive view of reality where, as long as we all work hard and go to college and pull up our socks, then we can go back to a time where, single income families and everybody owning their own house was a reality. And back to the 1950s or whatever. I think that is hopelessly naive. So, going forward, we are definitely going to have to contend with a lower material um, quality of life, even as technology. I don't think technology is going to go anywhere. We're still going to have the internet. We're still going to have, mobile phones and things like that. But we're already, living in that world. We're living in a world where most people can't afford their own home. We're living in a world where family formation is incredibly difficult, right? We're already living in that world. So I think it's going to continue in that direction, and we're going to struggle to in material terms, but it's also going to be good in some ways, right? Like tribalism is not automatically good, but it does at least solve trust problems, right? One of the big problems that we have today, and in fact, one of the reasons why we are so poor, is that we have low social trust, right? Like
Mm.
modern liberal societies assume that people can cooperate under these like neutral institutions, and that only works when these institutions are trusted and competent and everything. But that is those conditions are starting to weaken, so people are not trusting those abstractions. But tribalism, which is, essentially relying on concrete bonds, closer to the earth, closer to the family, right? Relying on the bonds of family, relying on the bonds of church or cult or neighborhood, and yes, indeed, ethnicity. um, that will restore high trust cooperation. Now, it's not going to be cooperation at the nation scale,
Mm.
but that's the trade-off.
I mean,
We're not.
some speaking of trade-off, yeah, I mean, I think some people wouldn't mind a lower level of, not that they would welcome it, but that they wouldn't mind it. They'd tolerate it. A lower level of affluence and maybe even technological comfort, if they could have a bit of that high trust society around them. For instance, I think of the Amish, who, they actually resist the technological and the comfort, and engage in hard work, and they don't have all the luxuries of a technologically advanced society. But I think one of the things that uh, makes it okay for them is because they have so many other things that the strictly modern society, a technologically advanced society, often lacks, especially in urban areas.
Yeah, absolutely. They have community, and that counts for quite a lot. It
Mm.
counts for quite a lot, even in material terms, but in what you might call spiritual terms, or maybe less sort of woo-woo, in cultural terms, like that is very important. And it one of the nice things I think about retribalization is that it will solve a huge problem for us today, which is the problem of meaning, right? Tribalism is very anti-nihilistic because like the liberal world often underscores the importance of things like career and consuming and entertainment and things like that, like and above all freedom, above all exerting your own like choices, asserting yourself as an individual. But that is clearly not enough for most people. Most people, that leaves them cold and empty at the end of the day. Whereas tribalism, living in these smaller, more organic communities where you have more face-to-face relationships and deeper, thicker bonds with people, that gives them a sense of belonging, a sense of a story. Like their lives are part of a bigger whole.
Right.
Right now, if with us in the modern West, what is the story of our civilization? It just seems to be abstraction piled upon abstraction. Whereas living in a more organic community like an Amish community, that gives you, you're part of something that's concrete and that you understand. So whereas liberalism can't answer questions like, who are my folk? Who are my people? What do I owe them? And what am I fighting for? What am I responsible for? Tribalism answers those questions very easily, because liberalism answers those questions with abstractions. You're fighting for freedom. You're fighting for equality. You're fighting for fairness. You're fighting for justice. I mean, justice is a great thing, but far more richly and strongly, if that question is answered with, you're fighting for your family, or you're fighting for those people over there that those people that you worship with and you attend church with and you do all these things with, if that's the answer to that question, that's a much stronger answer, and people are more inclined to actually believe it rather than to collapse into nihilistic consumption, which is basically what's happening now. So tribalism is very anti-nihilistic, and it really solves the problem of meaning. So there are a number of things that tribalism, a number of virtues that a retribalized world would have. It would be much closer to the earth. It would be much more, your life would be absolutely choked with meaning. But at the same time, we want to be realistic about this. It would also be a much more perilous world. It will be a more perilous world. And that's something that I want people to understand, is that is what's coming. We already sort of understand this because, we understand that to at least some extent, the powers that be, the state authority, is not really looking out for us, and that we kind of have to look out for ourselves. And it's the people who kind of put these structures into place early who are going to thrive in this environment when that becomes abundantly so clear that even the man in the street realizes that, oh man, if I dial 911, it's going to be 3 hours before the police show up, or whatever it is. So the people who get onto this early are going to be the ones that really, really thrive, and the people who don't are going to be they're going to be in big trouble.
Yeah. I actually want to kind of reframe your thesis a little bit and just talk from kind of the historical. You mentioned it a little bit earlier, like the historical, post Cold War reality. But I almost feel like in the last few years, that reality has changed somewhat. So like, the idea is that the central authority in Washington, or, needs or often desires a big enemy to consolidate power and to get the people behind the government, behind the sovereign. And, obviously during the Cold War, people in the West had that. It was the Soviet Union. And then that went away. And I think for a lot of people in the West, it changed, I think, the centralized authorities' attitude towards its population. Suddenly you have, centers of power in academia, NGOs, the government itself, suddenly see the threat or the enemy kind of within. The big problem in the world ceased to be threats from the outside, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was the alt-right or racism. There was this kind of top-down scolding of the population, that, whether the population within the United States or in the West would break up into these tribal units because of the rise of the internet, all these online tribes. And that was like, to a certain extent, I felt like the government's main threat, or the government felt like that was the main threat. And so a lot of their scolding and a lot of their ire was placed within, internally. But then I get a sense that changed in 2022. Oh, it changed several times recently, but certainly in 2022 with the Ukraine war. And in the next year after that, with the war against Hamas, Israel's war against Hamas, and more recently the war between Iran and the United States, or Israel and Iran. I get the sense that we've been given a reprieve to a certain extent, because I think the main power centers realize, well, we might need these people to fight our next war if these outside threats come about. So my point is that do you think that because things seem to be changing in the geopolitical sphere, that has some ramifications for, either centrifugal or centripetal ramifications for tribalism within the United States? Do you think people are going to rally and say, well, we need to come together as Americans and fight this outside threat, perceived outside threat? Or do you think that the tribalism will continue, or some kind of mixture of those two scenarios?
Yeah, so just to give the straightforward answer right up front, I think that tribalization will continue, but and I'll work up to why that is. It's interesting that you mentioned about the enemy without versus the enemy within, because I wrote an article way back. When did it come out? In 2022, actually, on the Substack called Our Ascetic Age. And by ascetic, I was invoking the Nietzschean idea of asceticism, which is that, he basically says that man is a predatory animal, and if he can't bite anything else, he'll bite himself, right? So that's essentially what asceticism is the strength of the master morality turned inward against itself. And that is kind of what's happened with the West, right? Where, as you say, once all of the external enemies had been defeated, I mean, you need an enemy. It's just an eternal aspect of societies. You need something against which to set yourself, because it gives you a sort of moral, it gives you a moral narrative. It gives you a myth, essentially, a Sorelian myth, pushing you forward. And if you don't have that enemy externally, then you turn around and you find it internally. And that's exactly what happened with the West, which is that once the Cold War was over, we basically turned inward and began to bite ourselves, right? And, from this flows all of the nonsense about intersectionality and wokeness and egalitarianism and multiculturalism. All of that flows, I think, so naturally that we don't even really need to explain it. And so, yeah, that's absolutely true. On the other hand, as you mentioned, we seem to have kind of, I don't want to say invented external enemies, because they certainly haven't been invented, but the hegemony of the West has now been challenged because the West has been so dilapidated for a time that it has essentially allowed multipolarity to come back. Basically, the West has dropped the ball, and as a result, China has been on the rise. Russia has, come back after being defeated in the Cold War, and now Iran looks like it basically has nuclearized, and all these problems are arising as a result of the global hegemon wasting its energy in fighting internal ghosts, like enemies that aren't even there inside of itself. So now we're kind of back to that. But part of what has caused the West to become dilapidated is not just the poisonous ideology of liberalism and humanism. It's also more like material factors than that. Things that, even if we were to, say, turn around and install like based absolute monarchist, God Emperor Trump, if he was like really the real deal, even if we did that, we would still have problems. And those problems are essentially like hard material facts of reality. The fact is that we have severe economic pressures because we've deindustrialized so far. We've outsourced much of our manufacturing to China. Everybody knows this. And when you invert, like everybody's seen that, like, the economic pyramid where the primary industries are at the bottom. These are things like, resource extraction and agriculture and whatnot. Just above that is like manufacturing, slightly less. Just above that is something like engineering and retail and everything. And just above that are like, quaternary industries that are more abstracted, things like education and research. And above that are things like propaganda, governance, and everything like that. Seems like we've inverted that pyramid, where now a big chunk of the economy is now devoted purely to propaganda, purely to education, purely to all of these things that should be just the very capstone of the pyramid. And that's a big problem. That, in fact, invites globalism, because if you don't have all those baseline industries at home, then wherever those industries exist, which is overseas, effectively becomes part of your political structure. So there's a reason why China is now effectively, like, there's a reason why globalism exists, and a lot of that is economic. That's just one pressure. We've also got demographic pressures, but also, we have the offshore havens that protect global elites from the state. And normal people see that there's a double standard. There's like one rule for them, and then there's one rule for the elites, and that makes them angry. And when they get angry, legitimacy drops. And legitimacy is such an important part of the social order, right? Legitimacy effectively is a kind of inverse friction coefficient. The more legitimate a state is, the more people are just like willing to go along with it. The more people are willing not to fight, and to do their part, to do their duty, and to pay their taxes, and to tell the truth, and all of these things. So we're losing on so many fronts. We're losing on the ideological and cultural front. We're losing on the economic front. We're losing on the demographic front. We're losing on the front of legitimacy as technology and digital networks proliferate. People are able to silo themselves away in ideologically, discrete networks. So basically, information silos where everybody has their own truth. Everybody has their own view of events. Everybody has their own interpretation of the news and what Trump's doing, and everything like that. And meanwhile, as I said, we've also got the rise of transnational actors and great powers like China, like Iran, like Russia, and all of this stuff. So I don't think that, it's certainly going to help to slow the decentralization move that's been happening, this great power rivalry, because, as you say, the state is going to release some pressure. It's going to relieve some pressure on normal people and say, hey, man in the street, let's stop kicking you over DEI initiatives just for a little bit so that you'll go fight your wars. You'll go fight our wars. That's going to happen. But all of these other things don't go away. And there is an even deeper one as well in the form of energy expenditure. Like we at peak oil and everything like that. But that is one that kind of deserves its own, its own little talk here. But anyway, I've laid out a bunch of them in general. There are way too many of these devolutionary pressures. They're overwhelmingly calibrated to move things downward rather than back towards the center.
Right. I mean, the assumption that a war with Iran or otherwise would create that unifying tendency also just kind of assumes that people have a short attention span or a short memory, and that we'll just be like, oh, okay, well, we'll just go right along and start, rallying behind the flag again for your foreign war. I mean, some people will probably have to sign up for that for their own, economic reasons. But I think a lot of people, it was just a year or two ago or three ago that, the military was complaining that new recruitment and enlistment numbers were at an all-time low. And I think they thought that if they could put Trump in there, that would change things. But yeah, I don't know. It might have, but I kind of doubt that I mean, it's kind of funny that when this war started with Iran, I think it was CNN. They said that we've polled the MAGA supporters, and 100% of MAGA voters back Trump in this new war in Iran.
MAGA GOP view of Trump. Approve 100%.
That can't be true, because there's just so many people who felt betrayed with this war starting. So yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's pure fantasy. It's not going to happen. Even his most ardent support is like Trump kind of almost can't fail in a way because he is such a mythic figure for people. But at the same time, you have to understand that Trump is going to die someday. And like it probably won't be that long. And even if he does live into his 90s, I don't think he's going to be really an effective galvanizing political figure. So there's an expiration date on Trumpism, or Trump as a political phenomenon. And once that goes, that might actually be the inciting incident that starts things devolving in a way that everybody can see. But in any case, whether that is or is not the case, the fact is that for people to want to die for country, you have to be able to offer them certain things. The country has to offer them certain things. It has to offer them opportunities. It has to offer them, the ability to afford to live somewhere, and especially to afford to form families.
Yeah.
But while, the divorce rate keeps climbing, men and women keep polarizing between like politically. And it's just like there's so many Zoomers and younger millennials out there that are really just struggling to get a date, or like, get married and find someone to build a family with. That, like, why would they die for their country if their country can't offer them that? The most basic thing in the entire world, something so basic that it predates even humans, that is forming a family and producing children of your own and everything. It's like the system has failed to such an extent that isn't even really feasible for most men now. And that is such a radicalizing force when a huge chunk of young men have no, mating prospects, when they have no prospects of romance or family or anything like that. They essentially become a sort of they become a kind of inert substance that can then be taken up and galvanized and used by radicalizing forces. And this is why the system is so worried. It's so worried about active clubs. It's so worried about all of these things. Anything that has to do with like normal guys being radicalized, that's its worst nightmare, because, when that happens, it's basically over for them. So it has to fight against these things, but it fights against them in ways that are actually making the problem worse instead of better. That is, by harping on and on about toxic masculinity, by going on and on about how the family is not actually something that you should want in the first place, and denigrating patriarchy, denigrating the family father, all of these things. That's making it worse rather than better. So
yeah. I mean, I think that there are these demographic headwinds, and family formation is really struggling. But do you think that to a certain extent that might actually be an impediment to the tribal future? I mean, for instance, like I'm thinking, in the 19th century, people had huge families. I'm thinking the Mormons, they went out and formed their new tribe, conquered new territory, had enormous families. And in the Utah territory, they were able to kind of like form their own sovereign community. They had their own police. They had their own, forming a state, pre-United States. But one of the kind of tools to achieve that was the big family and all those kinship ties that they brought with them. And I think like now, because people are having in the West 1.1, 1.5 children per couple, to a certain extent, as you yourself imply, that works in the favor of the state who wants to maintain sovereignty, because it keeps tribes from forming, because you're not going to, it's much easier to form a tribe when there's a lot of large families in an area that can kind of like cohere, um, rather than online. If you're just like an only child, you know, on TikTok or whatever, like how are you going to tribalize?
Yeah, I mean that's the play. That's what the centralizing state has, like, that's its gambit basically, is that if we can just essentially destroy the family, then that's kind of the final boss of intermediary structures that could ever rise up and challenge us. And it has captured all these other rival castles that sort of stand on top of the family, and like it's captured the clans centuries ago, tribes, it's captured unions, it's captured churches, it's captured all of these other things, and the family is kind of like the last sort of bastion of para sovereignty ultimately. um, but its ability to do that is predicated on a number of things. Specifically, it's predicated on competence. And that is something that has been declining precipitously for a long time. Our guy Ed Dutton has done some really, really good work on showing how the average intelligence has declined by something like 15 points from, I think it was about the 1870s to today, over a period of, let's just say, 150 years. That's an enormous IQ decline. That's like the difference between a competent technocrat and a, like, public school teacher or whatever. That's a big decline in competence. So that decline had, like, the centralizing state relies upon having a bureaucracy that works, a professional bureaucracy that's technically competent and rule bound and understands the rules and is relatively impartial and everything like that. So now we're getting weird stuff starting to happen, like infrastructure in the West is starting to stall, and you're getting these Kafka-esque administrative failures and missteps with the pandemic and everything like that. And again, it makes these problems create a legitimacy crisis, and legitimacy, that throws sand in the gears of the economy in addition to other things. So competence is declining, and that's something that the state relies upon to police, specifically to police family form, like not particular families, but to make sure that you aren't getting these sort of tribal enclaves that are cropping up under the radar. In addition to that, it requires an enormous amount of energy, right? The surveillance state, the AI revolution, and the surveillance state that sort of works in tandem with that relies upon an enormous, enormous amount of just energy, like caloric input, as well as water. And these are things that don't, they're not infinite. There's not an infinite supply of energy out there. So basically what's happening is that the surplus of energy is shrinking. I think early conventional oil and gas exploration had a yield of about 100 to 1. So for every 1 unit of input, you would get 100 units out of input. And modern sources of that are now in the single digits. We're down to like less than 10 to 1. That's an enormous, enormous decline over a relatively short period of time. So what this means is that it's going to be harder for the government to maintain the same level of complexity, because now that complexity costs more energy per unit of output. So you have to start sort of eating into other parts of the system just to keep the lights on. And of course, this causes legitimacy problems. It incentivizes the modern state to do this labor arbitrage thing where they import like millions upon millions of people, just to keep the economy rolling. And basically, as net energy declines, the cost of every act of governance goes up. And it's the same thing with legitimacy, because, like I say, legitimacy is, if people don't obey and people don't respect the state, and they don't see themselves as, like, there's no skin in the game, that elites are basically not among their folk in general, then they will make everything harder. And so policing, the cost of policing goes up. And I honestly don't think that the AI revolution is going to be a net gain in terms of policing efficacy, right? So
Mhm.
for every, let's just say, unit of gain where the AI revolution makes it easier to police, I think it's probably costing it slightly more than one unit, at least, in terms of legitimacy decline and also energy decline as well. Because here's the thing, cheap energy is what made the West possible. From the end of the medieval era, we went from burning, from burning like wood burning stoves to heat our homes and for our energy inputs to things like burning peat and then burning coal and then eventually with oil and then so on and so forth to nuclear and all of that. Um, and it was this huge, enormous growth in energy surplus that allowed us to build these centralized institutions, huge bureaucracies, mass welfare, mass conscription, and global militaries, and all that. That was all built on this abundant fuel, this abundant energy surplus. And because that surplus has declined so precipitously, I just don't see it being able to be maintained indefinitely. So, whereas it might seem for the moment, like the central state is able to effectively disintermediate the family, I don't think that that's going to continue on indefinitely. And right now, the state kind of has its focus on a particular type of family. It's not really focusing so much on the Dearborn, Michigans. It's more focusing on the native enclaves. I just don't think it's going to be able to maintain that over a long period of time. And when that ends, that's when tribalization is really going to start to it's going to start to become quite visible.
Yeah, I think there's this sense of like the juice ain't worth the squeeze anymore when it comes to um, these large kind of um, expenditures by state governments. Like think of the CCTV camera. To me, it's kind of like a totem of incompetence masquerading as a totem of vigilance and competence, because it just implies that something is amiss and that you can't trust the population. And I mean, obviously, in some areas you can't trust the population, but like the more the state tries to insert itself as we are a with the CCTV cameras, we are uh, a bastion of control of security. But they kind of betray their hand as being um, creators of a society that is by nature insecure and out of control. And those cameras kind of are a testament or a totem of that. Another big kind of highly visual spectacle is the degree to which like the big aircraft carriers and destroyers, these giant kind of totemistic icons of state power, were rendered fairly useless in the Persian Gulf recently by cheap drones from Iran. And I think this new kind of technological reality where you can confront large, expensive state apparatuses with cheap, kind of a cheap networked, like little pinpoint, like gadfly kind of attacks by drones. It shows the whole world that there's something wrong and that the sovereign is actually that the emperor has no clothes to a certain extent.
Yeah, very much. Sorry, there's a whole chapter in the book on the generations of warfare that goes into this idea, which is that scale does not necessarily equal effectiveness anymore. It equals effectiveness in certain domains, but it's not clear that those domains are decisive. So, just very briefly, there have been 5 generations of warfare so far. We're on the 5th. The first is essentially line and column warfare. You think of Napoleonic warfare, where you've got guys in tricolour hats lining up with muskets and very disciplined formations, large scale formations on the battlefield. And that was rendered, I mean, that was a huge improvement over medieval warfare, but it was rendered obsolete essentially by the second generation, which was the trench warfare. So, whereas the line and column warfare was you would win on the basis of mobility and speed, now actually the second generation warfare of World War One, where you've got artillery, you've got barbed wire, you've got trenches. Essentially, the deciding factor is attrition. That's how you win in warfare in World War One, roughly, let's say. And then in the third generation, how you get around the trenches is you use high maneuver warfare like blitzkrieg, right? So huge, like air forces and mechanization with tanks and everything like that. This was how they get around that. Once again, speed becomes the decisive factor. And this is the high centralization point. This is the point of war has never really been more centralized than this. We're thinking World War II, maybe the Korea War as well, where it requires a massive state with an industrial base to make all of this happen. And then the fourth generation comes along, and it's a very traumatic thing because it says, no, actually, the decisive factor in warfare really is attrition because now we have guerrilla warfare. And this is why Vietnam was so traumatic for America, not just because it was traumatic to the individuals involved, but it was traumatic civilizationally because it said that actually this sort of little Southeast Asian backwater can hold its own against a military superpower simply by waging kind of Maoist insurgent style of warfare, right? Where non-state actors fight states asymmetrically, and the battlefield could be anywhere. And the fog of war starts to become enormously impactful, right? And this is the rise of para-sovereigns that don't need tanks, they don't need air forces. All they need is just not to lose for long enough. And it wasn't just Vietnam. This also happened in Afghanistan in the first war against the Soviets, right? In the late 1980s. This is a big part of why the Soviet Union was ground down and essentially pushed over by America, is that they had the same problem with the Afghanis in the late 1980s. So at that point, fourth generation warfare, which is, let's just call it guerrilla warfare, says that big states aren't actually the ones that win anymore. And then the fifth generation warfare essentially extends that. It extends it as informational warfare. So warfare is not just about having like guerrilla forces being able to harass, like you say, like gadfly, like harassing these larger forces. Not only that, but it also becomes a warfare about information. It becomes a warfare about um, you know uh, demoralizing the other side and saying that and propagandizing the other side to believe that it's actually fighting an immoral war, and it becomes an economic warfare as well, right? Like we saw with America essentially trying to choke Russia off in the 2022 war with sanctions and cutting them off from SWIFT, all of these things. That was America's, flexing its might and saying, we control the world infrastructure essentially. So you're going to have to knuckle under. And Russia said, nope, because they had been building resilience against that for many, many years. And now, actually, as it turns out, being the global hegemon is not decisive. And so one of the interesting things that happened when Russia, the Russia-Ukraine war began, is that all of a sudden there seemed to be like an enormous amount of cyber warfare that was hitting key American targets from who knows where, right? So there was this plausible deniability that the cyber warfare was being waged by, anonymous digital actors. When I mean, we can all imagine where that was coming from. So basically, warfare is becoming more and more decentralized, more asymmetrical. A guy with a laptop can build something like Bitcoin that destabilizes the global banking system, even if it doesn't tip it over. It certainly has made a big dent in it. So Nowadays warfare is even more decentralized than it has ever been, and we are seeing this as well with the Iran war in the last year or two. So it's no longer clear that it actually makes a lot of sense for societies to be organized at the level of the nation state. Maybe it makes more sense for them to be sort of federated, uh, more autonomous local areas. Now that's something that hasn't happened yet, but I think that that might be something that's coming. And this is like this environment of fifth generation warfare, where it's more asymmetrical than it's been, in centuries. This is where parasovereigns thrive because they don't need the tanks. They don't have to follow international rules of warfare. They use informational warfare. They use lawfare. They are very agile. They're able to like move and pivot very quickly, whereas states much less so. They have to justify things to their populations. They have to do things like draft people, or even in absence of a draft, they have to get volunteers to come and fight. This is not something that's really the case for these para-sovereigns. So I think it's actually the asymmetry favors these lower level authorities that are sort of eating away at the sovereign authority of the center right now.
Yeah. I mean, your book discusses the idea of the feral city. One of the chapters, I think 15 or 16 or something like that. But this is an example of, not only are these outside pressures, like an Iran is able to harry and harass American ability to project kind of power, but even within the confines of the state, there's urban areas where that is actually happening as well. So maybe talk about how in a sense, like the centralized authorities are fighting a bit of a two-front war, one against the internal pressures of like state devolution or urban decay, as well as the rise of the new BRICS, new BRICS states in China and Russia, Iran, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, let's talk a little bit about the feral city. This is a concept that was brought to light by a guy by the name of Richard Norton, who was a former professor at the U.S. Naval War College. And the feral city is essentially, well, he defines it as something like an urban environment where the state governs in name, but it can't actually enforce any law or provide any services. And so de facto, it's actually ruled by non-state actors. So you might think of something like Mogadishu as a good example of a feral city. But there are feral environments, feral neighborhoods in modern cities. There are large portions of cities like San Francisco where effectively it's like an open air drug market, and criminal like gangs effectively enforce order, especially at nighttime. Maybe not so much during the day. But basically, you could see this in no-go zones in places like Molenbeek in Belgium or Malmo in Sweden, and certain parts of even the UK as well, where essential services are so degraded that they have to be provided by private actors, and that criminal enterprises, like these criminal organizations, actually sort of govern life from day to day. Whether it's they, like I said before with the para sovereigns, they take up sovereign functions. They might run an extortion racket, which is another way of saying a taxation system, right? They might run, mafia justice in absence of state justice, and as a result, this it effectively is a kind of like little micro secession within a social order, and it's something that is very dangerous for the sovereign center because these things have a way of metastasizing. It's something that the sovereign center has to contain. And the reason why a feral city is allowed effectively to exist is because it's sort of more trouble than it's worth. The the sovereign center looks at it as, okay, we're just going to contain that here. This obviously is a huge problem, and for us to go in there and to dig into it and start extracting and eradicating all these cartels and all these criminal orgs and all these gangs and everything like that, it's too difficult. I mean, we could probably achieve it, but at what cost? So they just say the cost is too high. We're going to leave it there, but we're just going to kind of contain it. And it's important because this is already happening in the West. So the core insight of this is that sovereignty is more than just geographic. It's something that's also institutional, because you have to actually be present in order to have, if enforce sovereignty. You have to enforce law on the ground, and if you don't do that, then effectively you've given it up. And this is happening in cities now, and I think that's the importance of the feral city. I'm sorry, I've forgotten what was you had the second part of your question. What was that?
Oh, just how, I mean, I was, it wasn't so much a question for you. I was just making a correlation between what we were talking about before with the drone warfare coming from Iran and the feral city, both of which, an external and an internal pressure, kind of being a problem for the state and its sense of that it's the hegemon. So these are ways that things are slipping its control.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have these pressures from above and pressures from below. So a good example of a pressure from below is just that, is the feral city. Pressures from above would be, for example, the issues with Iran. Where Iran has, I mean, I haven't been following the war too closely recently, but obviously the closing of the Strait of Hormuz has had very, very significant downstream effects for, oil prices and the just energy prices in the West. And so that's an example of a pressure from above. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. There's a sense in which I think when people think of like kind of modern tribalism, a lot of it is like facilitated by kind of extreme online behavior. You have, the internet, social media allows people to kind of hive themselves off into these little disparate groups. And that, you can get into furries and get into, Dungeons and Dragons or whatever little interest you have. You can find a tribe that's out there for you. And to a certain extent, you have, to the degree to which you have political tribes forming online, I think a lot of times those tend to also kind of, I mean, in a way, they're tribal, but I almost get the sense that in some cases, these tribes almost accentuate the power of the central state because they keep tribes from forming. For instance, like within like the dissident right sphere, you have the Groypers, you have, what's left of the alt-right, you have these different factional groups that often engage in infighting more than they engage in kind of consolidating a tribal power. And so maybe there's, to a certain extent, the centripetal forces within the centralized authority, they actually like the online tribalism, or at least, they're not as worried about it as one would automatically assume.
Yeah, I mean, certainly online tribalism is preferable to IRL tribalism in the eyes of the state. There's no question about that. But the question is whether the online tribalism is acting as a kind of lightning rod that grounds and disperses that energy, or whether it actually is funneling that energy into like real organizations. So I mentioned before about the active clubs. This is something that the state is very worried about. If you are at all involved in one of these things, then you are definitely within their ambit. They have eyes on you, because they're worried about this sort of thing, that these active clubs are going to turn into, like Project Mayhem in Fight Club, right? They're worried
Yeah.
that they're gonna kind of evolve into like terrorist cells. And there may be some validity to that worry, right? It's certainly possible anyway.
Right. And I think there's a fear though that a lot of times that you have groups that try to migrate from the online to the IRL, like those tend to get, I don't know, I'm a little bit suspicious of this when it happens, but they tend to get fed jacketed by kind of online voices. They're like, oh, look at Patriot Front or look at the active clubs or whatever. Those are just feds. So stay away from them. And of course, when you make a commitment and you join in the real world, you are kind of putting yourself to a certain extent at risk, more so than you would if you just stayed behind your computer all day. But I think the fact that those kinds of real world tribes are subject to scrutiny by online tribes makes me think that, yeah, maybe the state authorities are worried that they might actually have some real world tribal traction.
Yeah, they're definitely worried about that. I think that these like online subcultures tend to foster tribalization. Like I see the argument of like how they kind of act as a ersatz or like fake tribalism, in the same way that people make this argument about sports and everything like that. Sports ball, right? Where
Sports
it's
ball, yeah.
something that it just stands in for, tribalism, or you're literally cheering for the home team, but you're turning in your neighbor or whatever it is, right? It's I see that argument, but I think that the general logic and the way that the online subcultures make people think is very much it's very much more leading towards tribalization than away from it. And it does this by the mechanism that I've called the epistemic divorce, which is basically the idea that um, in fragmenting, it's like part of the reason, like one of the things that I've said, I didn't say this in the book, but I've put it out in many articles in my Substack, which is that postmodernism is actually way, way more tribal and way more traditionalist than people think. It's a very hard thing for people to get our heads around, because we're kind of all in Jordan Peterson mode of thinking, where postmodernism is the complete opposite to traditionalism. It's the complete opposite to the traditional social order, where everything is non-relative, and we have these like essentialist ideas. But really what postmodernism is the fragmentation of moral and epistemic life. It is the uh, reversal of this consolidation of the epistemic world into smaller and into larger and larger, into fewer and fewer units. Right? We used to believe that our tribe was essentially a horizon, as a horizon of care, but it was also our myths are true and their myths are wrong. And over time, we went from that to a sort of more nation-based understanding, where they have their ways, we have our ways, but we're still sort of like a cohesive people. And then over time, with the growth of Christianity, we had this sort of international horizon, this universalist horizon, and then that goes through a certain number of iterations, devolves into the Middle Ages, and the Middle Ages sort of reconstituted into the modern age, where we get like a true universalism, true globalism. Basically, our way of thinking, our concepts, our language, our everything, like our conceptual apparatus becomes greater and greater. It encompasses all humanity, to where now, whether you're a Chinese technocrat or a Muslim theocrat or a liberal secular humanist, everybody basically thinks in the same terms and uses the same political concepts and all of these things. What postmodernism does is it completely fragments them. And I think that this fragmentation is actually much more traditional than the universalist conception. But postmodernism aside, that is exactly what technology is doing. Technology is driving this epistemic divorce, where no longer do we have these big meta narratives that we all believe. No longer do we listen to the same music. We don't read the same news. We don't watch the same TV. We don't watch the same movies. We effectively are becoming more than one culture. This global monoculture is beginning to fragment, and that fragmentation is exactly the precondition that's required for tribalism. So I think that even though there is a sort of sense in which online subcultures are sort of stand-in fake tribalism, they're actually laying the groundwork in a much deeper and more conceptual way for us to begin thinking in tribal ways, for us to begin thinking in terms of my guys and us and then them. Because the us is much, much smaller if it's really, much of what your social life is based on is, maybe like a Telegram channel of 100 people or
Yeah.
your Discord server or, just the people that you interact with on Facebook. It's even though that's dispersed geographically, in a cultural and in a spiritual way, you are actually much more tribal by being very online than being part of a nation of millions.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate what you were saying about postmodernism, in the sense. I mean, you're right. It very much lends itself to um, paganism. Or I think the main thrust of postmodernism was kind of against master narratives, eschewing the master narrative, and in a way, like I think the assumption when postmodernism first started getting going, in the 60s or whatever, that a lot of, people in academia assumed that postmodernism was going to be a way to stick it to the man or something where postmodernism's like, oh, we're not going to have these master narratives of heteronormativity or, patriarchy or, Christianity in some ways. We're going to eschew the master narratives that have been our inheritance in the modern West. But I've long thought that postmodernism can be flipped onto the very structures that question that itself. So, if you're into anti-essentialism, then anti-essentialism can be a form of essentialism that postmodernism, if it's questioning master narratives, you could say, well, do we have to anti-essentialism can be its own master narrative that we can reject, and therefore we can have essentialism. There's a certain sense in which postmodernism eats itself and chews up so many master narratives that you cease to have the universalism, you cease to have this kind of consolidating ideology, and you're free to explore these other kind of localized realities that one might call paganism, that one might call like tribalism. So yeah, I totally see what you're going with there
Yeah, definitely.
in your strange embrace of postmodernism.
Yeah, people really don't like that, and I kind of get a kick out of how much people don't like it.
I like it.
But there are a number of people who absolutely see where I'm going with it, and they realize that it's leading somewhere real, somewhere much deeper and stranger and older than what we call traditionalism, quote unquote, today, right? Because you're right about postmodernism. What the fundamental, if you could boil it down to one imperative, it's the imperative to destroy meta narratives, to destroy these grand, like unifying narratives that hold all of society together. And in doing that, like clearly the reason why the the ambition to do that was motivated by a desire to destroy Christianity. But and it succeeded. It actually succeeded wildly. But in destroying Christianity, what happened was it actually destroyed the foundations of liberalism, because liberalism is just secularized Christianity.
Right.
And in destroying the foundations of liberalism, it destroyed the foundations of egalitarianism, of multiculturalism, of all the things that most postmodernists care about. So it was one of the biggest own goals in all of intellectual history. And now what's been revealed is that what exists when you get rid of that post-Christian or quasi-Christian meta-narrative is effectively tribal narratives, because there are eternal realities of folkhood. It's not like, they thought that by getting rid of the meta-narrative that unites all humanity and all the West, by getting rid of universalism, what you would leave in its place is individualism. But that's not real. Individualism is actually a result and a byproduct of Christianity, strangely enough. I mean, we could talk about that, but that is the case. And it was wrong. Actually, by getting rid of Christianity, it's not like you leave individualism in its place. What you leave in its place is folkishness. And that's the problem. That's the problem for postmodernists. And that's why I think postmodernism is actually a great friend to traditionalism.
Yeah, very interesting. So I think we're kind of coming on a point where you might have to leave soon, and we've gone a bit. But I was just wondering if you had anything to say in terms of speaking of the future. What prescriptively would you recommend young men and people in general to do to maybe mitigate the downsides of a tribal future, and maybe even thrive in a tribal future? I don't know if you're willing or able to discuss that aspect of this. I mean, obviously, family formation is part of it, as hard as that might be. What would you recommend for guys to do?
Sure. Well, I mean, I can keep it general, and that'll keep us safe here, I think. Above all, you need to think of yourself not as an isolated individual, right? That the worst position in a tribalized society would be to be this lone wolf that has no real loyalties and nobody loyal to him. So that's the first step, is really to stop thinking individualistically. The second step is to build a real household. And I know that that's tall order. For most people, that is the problem. That's why they're angry at the system, is because they can't do that. But the household really is the first political unit. Even before the tribe, even before the clan, it's the household. So that's important. That's something that you need to build by hook or by crook. And also an important element in the book that we didn't really get a chance to go into that much is that much of how tribalism has operated both historically and in modern times is by what's called fictive kinship, which is to say that people build kinship structures out of the elements that are sort of ready to hand, whether those are people that you've sworn oaths to, religious oaths, people who you worship with, maybe people even who you're business partners with, godparents and your neighbors and people you can rely on, basically. So when states historically have weakened, people who are not strictly kin, often they will become kin-like. They'll sort of band together in these fictive kinship organizations that do eventually, over the course of decades and centuries, they become real, actual kinships by intermarriage and things like that. So if you don't have a tribe by blood, you need to build one by loyalty, and ideally one that is involved with both. So this would involve doing things like joining thick communities, or thick bonds. So people who help with your children, you help with theirs, people you share meals with, people who worship together, who build things together. the future really belongs to these thick communities. So some practical examples might be a homeschool group or a religious congregation. This is why pagans are building kindreds and tribes, literal tribes at the moment, right, with religious worship. Even things like men's fraternities, that would be a good start for many people. And this is again why things like the active clubs are so denigrated. So yeah, I think those are some social things that you can do. There's also practical stuff that you can do. You really want to develop some useful and concrete skills. You 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 can't be a specialist. And if you're going to be a specialist, it better be something very practical like engineering or something like that. Like there's a funny meme of like, okay, now the collapse has happened, so let's get everybody together. And there's this big army of like, doomer wojacks that are saying, okay, I brought my Evola books. That's not going to help, right? You need to know how to cook. You need to know first aid. You need to know how to fix your car. You need to know how to grow food. You need to know how to get fit. You need to probably know how to handle a weapon if that's legal where you live. Some idea of security awareness at the very least. You need to know how to teach children. You need to know how to run a small business. You need to know something about logistics. You need to know how to negotiate with people. You need practical skills, right?
Yeah.
That's something that everybody can start learning tomorrow. Like just go on to Chat GPT and ask, how do I grow a garden? How do I do this? How do I cook, whatever? How do I preserve food? How do I do all these things?
Yeah.
So that was very useful. If you can, obviously this is like, not everyone can do this. Try to own productive assets if you can. Whether that be tools, land, if you can. Try to run a business from home if you can, decoupling from the system. Learn trade skills. If you're looking to, if you're at the beginning of your career, you're a young man, a young woman, learn some sort of trade skill. Learn to be an electrician. Learn how to run a CNC machine, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so if you can like learn useful skills, compile productive assets, get the loyalty of other people, start living more locally, do not become dependent on any of these predatory parasovereigns that I see developing over time. Some of them will offer you real protection, but some of them will most of them will just become predators.
Yeah.
And
I mean, the good news is most of your advice is probably just good advice, even if society weren't collapsing or isn't collapsing. It's just good advice to be a stable person.
Yeah, exactly. So take it seriously. Above all, this is real. This is coming, and you've only got so much time to prepare. So the person who's been preparing for a decade or two is going to be a much, much better position than the person who is just kind of caught with their pants down. And, overall, I would say, think in terms of generations. Think in terms of your ancestors and descendants. This is part of why I am such a proponent of the ancestor cult, which is that, you need to make decisions on the basis of what would my great-great-grandfather want me to do, and what would my great-great-grandson want me to have done before he's born. What is it that I'm handing down? Who's going to inherit my memory and my property and my skills and everything? What is it like that will outlive me? And this is the core mindset that I think that we need in a tribal future. So yeah, I think that's the overall orientation.
That's great. Yeah, I'll probably edit this bit out, but I'm keen to show you my ancestor veneration app that I've been working on.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see
it's
that.
coming, and it's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm really excited that you've embarked upon this initiative, and also I'm writing a book on this. It'll be out later this year. It's like, I don't know if you saw our practical guides to lawfare.
Oh yeah,
Came out I think last year. there's going to be a practical guide to the ancestor cult. Is going to be the next edition in that series. So
Great.
maybe the app and the book could work together in some ways.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I'll promote the book with the app and vice versa. So yeah, cool. All right. Anything else you wanted to add, or?
No, I think that's a good point to end on. Basically, giving folks some practical advice. You just have to build the good tribe before the bad tribe arrives.
Yeah.
You don't want to wait until there's a gang sort of knocking on your door. You know what I mean? You want to produce a household before that happens. The future will be decided by the people who organize first. So make sure that's you. Read the book, because I think that once you read it, you will take this more seriously. And once you do take it more seriously, you're going to be on the pathway to healing. So yeah, that would be my final word.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mike, and take care. And any other thing you want to add about where people can follow you? I think most people already know, but just in case.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we are at imperiumpress.org. That's where you can find basically everything. Find us on Telegram, find us on YouTube, find us on Twitter. Look for Hearthfire Radio as well. That's our pagan podcast platform that we've got content coming out multiple times a week, many shows. I think we got a dozen shows on there now. Lee, you've joined us for one of them. We've got lots of other content that people are going to love, and it's one of these parallel structures. This is an alternative to something like Spotify or something like Netflix. That is exactly what people should be building, in addition to building the ancestor cult app and some of these other apps that I know that people are developing right now. This is good. I like this. I think we should be doing that stuff. So check out Hearthfire Radio, check out imperiumpress.org. And I just want to say thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. All right. Well, take care. Don't be a stranger.